Okay, good afternoon. It is 2 o'clock on May 7th. This is Mr. Murray. I am going to be going over chapters 25 and 26 of To Kill a Mockingbird. We are pretty close to the end of the novel. I think there are 31 chapters total, so we're zeroing into the finale. Last week in the discussion, Brianna remembered that the story is really about Scout remembering when her older brother broke his arm. So that's just something to keep in mind, that that's still a major event that has not taken place yet. So good memory last week. And I think someone else, Elijah maybe, said that he remembered that as well. So good job remembering that from the very first couple of lines of the very first chapter. As we continue, before I get into the chapter 25, I just want to point out that if you go to the Google Classrooms, week 3's answers for the packet are there, and these are just the answers to the language arts section of the packet, but those are there. If you want to click on that, you can check your work, and this is the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday activities that are kind of like jumbled up language arts questions. So the answers for this week are all there. If you have any questions about why something's right or why something's wrong, feel free to ask. A few of them, there's more than one potential correct answer, so I wrote a little note before I typed an example in front of those ones, like answers will vary. So again, do the work first and then use this to check it, but the answers are there if you want to go ahead and check your own work. So let's get to chapter 25. So chapter 25, we're winding down. The trial is over. Summer's over. Dill has left. Jem and Scout are sleeping on the back porch, or getting ready to go to sleep on the back porch, rather, when Jem shares some information with Scout. He tells her, okay, hey, Elijah, welcome. So we were just talking about chapter 25. In chapter 25, the chapter begins with Jem informing Scout that he actually went with Atticus to tell Helen Robinson about Tom's death. So if you remember from last chapter, Scout was at that party that Aunt Alexandria was hosting. During that, Atticus interrupted to pick up Calpurnia, and then he took Calpurnia away. Scout stayed at the party with Miss Maud and Aunt Alexandria. We find out that Dill and Jem, who had been swimming, if you remember, which is why Scout wasn't playing with them, they pass by Atticus, so Atticus picks them up because it's kind of late, so he takes them with him to Helen Robinson's house. They stay in the car when Calpurnia and Atticus go inside to talk to Helen. They see Helen faint. She has to be carried by Atticus. Calpurnia actually stays there for some time. We're not sure exactly how long, because eventually Atticus leaves and takes Dill and Jem home. On the way back, they have to pass by the Yules, because if you remember, the African Americans live beyond the dump, which is where the Yules live. The Yules shout at Atticus's car. Jem says he's not sure what they said, but he knows that they're shouting at him. And this is just like a little hint the author is giving you that the conflict between the Yules and Atticus isn't over yet. So even though Atticus has said it's over, he thinks that everyone's ready to move on, the Yules, to them, it's not over. They were embarrassed by Atticus, and they're still very upset by that. So this is just like one little hint to let you know that Atticus, in his thought process that this is all over and the family can move on, to the Yules, it's not over yet. So this is just a little clue for that. There's some aftermath to Tom's death. We find out that he's the focus of gossip for a couple of days. Most of the townspeople seem to blame Tom for trying to escape. So even though they wanted to convict him, right, and basically all the white people in town, other than a handful, wanted to see him convicted, now all of a sudden it seems like the same people who think like Atticus could never have possibly won the trial also think that Atticus probably would have won the appeal. So they kind of blame Tom for trying to escape, like it was his fault for getting frustrated and trying to run away, when if he had been patient, Atticus would have eventually gotten him free. They also insult Tom's intelligence, and they don't bother to hide their racism when they're doing this. Mr. Underwood, if you remember, this is the gentleman who runs the newspaper and who was helping Atticus when the mob came to get Tom. He actually was like kind of hidden in the newspaper office with a shotgun and was there to back Atticus up if need be. If things had gotten violent, he intended to step in. No one really knows he was there other than Atticus and the kids, though, because he didn't have to end up using his gun. But Mr. Underwood, who we know is actually very racist, rates a scathing editorial comparing Tom's death to the killing of songbirds, aka mockingbirds, which is kind of where the story gets its title. But he seems to like blame the entire town for Tom's death. That Tom was an innocent, that his death was senseless, and he was basically, it's akin to killing a songbird, something that wasn't harming anyone, and someone just goes out of their way to hurt it for no good reason. Scout initially disagrees with Mr. Underwood's assessment, thinking that it was senseless. First, she thinks that Tom was given a fair trial, and Atticus tried, he lost, and that's kind of just the way the world works. But then after she reflects for a while, she comes to realize that Atticus probably never could have won, because as good of a lawyer as he is and as smart as he is, he could never really get into the hearts of people. And since these people had this racism inside of them, Atticus really never had a chance to convince them to let Tom loose. So there's a line where she says Tom was a dead man the moment Mayella accused him, and that just, as soon as a white woman accused a black man of something violence related, he was dead from that point on. And this is something that Tom echoes in the trial when he's being questioned by the prosecutor, and he runs away, or he ran away. The prosecutor asked, well, why'd you run away? And Tom's response was, like, I knew I was in trouble because of what she accused me of. I knew I was going to be punished for something I didn't do. So Scout comes to the same realization that Tom came to. It just took her a lot longer to see it. Another interesting thing to note here is how the townspeople react to the editorial, because here Mr. Underwood is actively like confronting the townspeople for their racism, and they kind of just brush it off. So Mr. Underwood had said in the editorial he didn't care if people cancel their subscriptions. They don't cancel their subscriptions, they just think he's making a fool of himself and ignore it. So even when the racism's called out, they just kind of ignore it. They don't bother to connect the tragedy to their racist views. Like, they hold the racist views, they see the tragedy of Tom's death, but they don't connect how the racism caused the death. Rather, they blame Tom for his own death instead of blaming the situation. The last thing I'll mention about this chapter, as this chapter is really short, is the impact that the trial has had on Jem. Scout describes Jem as being acting more like a girl. Scout's going to kill a bug at one point. He tells her not to hurt it because it's not hurting anyone, and just to let it go. So what it seems like he's doing is he's overcompensating. In the trial, he knew that Tom was innocent, but Jem, being 12 years old, had no way of helping him. So now he's kind of extending this empathy to other helpless creatures. So the fact that this bug is helpless, he wants to at least help it. He's like extending his empathy, kind of overcompensating for the problems in the world around him. And that's something that happens sometimes to people who witness, tragedies or take part in a tragedy. They kind of overcompensate in one area, as a way to get control back. So another thing here too, before we move to chapter 26, this story is a coming of age story, and what that means is we're watching Scout and Jem from childhood coming into like not quite adulthood but teenagehood, I guess. So like they're becoming more adult like as it's going on. Like in the very beginning, if you remember how childlike they were putting on their little plays. They were tormenting Boo Radley. It was all very childish and innocent. And now that they've seen this tragedy, they're both being forced to kind of grow up because they had to confront something very adult-like. And it requires that they become more mature to handle it. So that's the end of chapter 26. 25, chapter 26, which will be the last one that we go over today. This one deals with a lot more character growth as well. School started at this point, and Scout's reflecting at one point on how she had tormented Boo Radley for a couple of years. At one point, she can't even remember how long it's been. It's actually been 2 years since the stories began. She confides in Atticus that she was still wondering about Boo. Even though she regrets having bothered the man, she still wishes one day she could just bump into him and say hi. So she has this like idea in her head that one day she'll just be walking down the street. He'll be walking down the street, and she'll just say hello to him. He'll say hello back, and they'll continue on their ways. At this point, Atticus, when she mentions to Atticus she still would like to see Boo, Atticus mentions that it's dangerous to go over there and not to torment the man, and that Mr. Radley will shoot a gun at anyone who's in the area, like an intruder at night. And Atticus lets Scout know that he was aware that chapters ago when Scout and Jem had tried to sneak into the Radley place and Jem lost his pants and the gun had been shot in the air, he's aware that they were there. So even though that night he lets them kind of get away with it by saying they were playing strip poker and that's how he lost his pants, Atticus really knew all along what had happened. He just kind of let it go. But he was always aware. And it's one of those instances where Atticus is more aware of the situation than the kids think. It's similar to when Atticus was speaking to his brother about the trial and Scout was overhearing him. So, like, Atticus will occasionally let the kids think they're getting away with something when he wants them to be there. That's one of the things people point out when they talk about whether or not Atticus was aware that the kids were at the trial to begin with. Like, there's some evidence there to suggest that he probably was aware that they were up there watching, and he just wanted them to be there so they would learn something important about how the town really was. We also learned that at school, the white parents have told their children to be nice to Jem and Scout, to not hold Atticus's embarrassment against them. Scout and Jem both would probably rather have just gotten into a few fistfights than to have dealt with things that way. But because of Atticus's teaching about how they're not supposed to fight unless they absolutely have to, they both just kind of have to keep their heads up. And Scout compares this to how they had to deal with Miss Du Bois years ago, where she would say things to them, treat them kind of unfairly, but they just had to keep their heads up. Scout does also point out that it's kind of odd that the townspeople continue to elect Atticus to go to the state legislature. So we know he's a councilman, like he works at the House of Representatives. He's like, in the Congress for the state, and the townspeople still vote for him. And in fact, nobody runs against him when he's up for re-election. So they still respect him. They just disagree with what he did. And he's been unable to convince them that the racism was wrong. Mr. Underwood was unable to convince them that the racism was wrong. Tom's death was unable to convince them that the racism was wrong. So they still respect him. They just disagree with him on this one thing. In school, something interesting comes up. We find out that the kids are learning about Hitler. So we know it's in the late 30s by this point. We're not sure exactly what the exact date is, but America's not involved in the war yet, so it's not the 40s. And we know it's in the Depression, so it's definitely in the 30s. So we're probably in the late 30s at this point. If Hitler's already starting to confiscate property from the Jewish population and starting to put mentally disabled people in internment camps, then we definitely know it's in the later part of the 1930s. So anyways, the teacher and the kids are talking about Hitler. The teacher talks about how Hitler's such a bad guy, and one of the reasons he's able to do these awful things to the Jewish population is because they don't live in a democracy. They live in a dictatorship, so he can get away with things. She also points out the fact that Jewish people are the same as everybody else, and they should be treated with respect. A student pipes in at that point saying, well, they're white, so of course they're equal. So it kind of just shows how ingrained the racism is at this time period, where white means you're equal. Anyone who's not white, it's okay for them not to be equal, but because the Jewish people are white, of course they're still on the same wavelength as all other white people. Scout sees the hypocrisy here, but the kids and the teacher do not. So the idea that like far away in another country, people are being mistreated, that's wrong. But in their own community, people are being mistreated, that's okay. Like they don't see a correlation. It's very similar to the ladies at the dinner party of Aunt Alexandria, how they thought it was a good thing for a missionary to go to Africa and try to help people over there, but it was a bad thing for Atticus to try to help an African American in their town. So like they're just missing the point. Like A equals B, but not if C, right? Like it equals that over there, but not here. Um, Scout reflects on this. She tries to justify it in her own head. She eventually tries to talk to Atticus about it, but gives up and instead decides to talk to Jem. Jem, who is at this point in middle school, he wants to play football. He's been like gorging himself on bananas and milk, and he's trying to put on weight so that he can actually play next year. At this point, he's just like the person who passes out the water bottles. But he sees himself as more adult-like. He views himself as wise. So he's actually like pleased when Scout comes to ask him a question. He like stops reading a magazine. He sits up to talk to her. So he likes that adult like role that he's given sometimes when he interacts with his sister. But when she asks him about why it was okay for people to hate Hitler but be okay with mistreating people in their own town, he just explodes. He tells her never to bring up the trial again. He yells at her. She leaves the room all upset, not able to understand what happened. She goes to Atticus for comfort, and Atticus explains that Jem's just not ready yet, that he's burying his feelings, and when he's ready to talk about those feelings, he'll like work them out on his own time, but he needs to just be left alone. So again, like really short chapter. The main thing you should remember from chapter 26 is the theme, the coming of age theme. The idea that Scout and Jem are both becoming older. They're losing that childhood innocence. Scout's grappling with like hypocrisy, and which is kind of like a big, a high-end thing for like a child to be thinking about. At this point in the story, I believe she's 9. I'm pretty sure the story ends when she's 9 and Jem's 12. So she's still really young. Jem and Scout are both affected by the trial, but in different ways. So Jem's worldview, thinking that the adult world was a better place, it was something to look forward to becoming an adult, and it was fair, and it was just, and it made sense. He's learned that's not the case. It's kind of shattered his worldview, right? And now he's trying to like pick up the pieces, and he wants to just not think about it for a while and like bury the problems. Scout, on the other hand, still growing up, so she hasn't hit that age where she thinks she's an adult yet. So she's still actively trying to use the trial to develop her own worldview. So it didn't shatter her worldview. She's using it to build her worldview, if that makes sense. Whereas Jem already had a functional worldview, and the trial kind of shattered it. So they kind of like both started out in similar spots, but the trial affected them deeply in different ways. Boo no longer being a source of like fear or curiosity kind of lends to the idea that Scout's growing up. He's no longer like a boogeyman. Instead, she kind of regrets what she did with him. It shows a level of maturity. She's starting to actually see the world for how it is. She'd still like to interact with the man because he is kind of a curiosity, but her views of Boo kind of demonstrate how much she's grown up. So those 2 chapters are really short. Next week we should be able to get through chapters 27 and 28, and hopefully on Thursday just do the last 3. The last couple chapters are really short, and the ending is actually pretty exciting. So if you go onto Google Classrooms, let me minimize that. Okay, so if you go into Google Classrooms, those summaries are there for you to look at. The packet answers are also there, and the quiz for this chapter is also here. I combined chapters 25 and 26 together into one quiz. Unlike a lot of the other quizzes, this one is not multiple choice. This one is all short answers. So you will have to read through, reflect, and give me an interesting answer to all of these. Most of these you can refer to the summaries if you get stuck. But having just read the chapter and discussed it, you should be able to get through these pretty easily. So, after reflecting on the trial, Scout decides that Atticus never had a chance to win the trial. Do you agree that the jury was always going to find Tom guilty? Why or why not? Now, there are a couple of ways you could go with this. Scout decides that Atticus could never have won, right? Atticus thinks that it was very unlikely that he was going to win. And he mentions that to his sister, he mentions that to his brother. He suggests that his best chance would be on an appeal, because the appeal would just be with judges. He wouldn't have to deal with as much prejudice, presumably. He thinks that's his best shot. But he still goes through the motions during the trial, and he does have some success during the trial. If you remember, most people thought that the jury would only deliberate for like a few minutes and come back really quick. Instead, they stay out for a long time. It's almost midnight before they come back. So that means they deliberated from around dinner time, which I think the jury goes back around 7 or so, and then they don't come out until nearly midnight. So they did talk. We know that one of the Cunninghams was on the jury, and he argued for an acquittal for quite some time before finally giving in. So those are all positive aspects that you could use to argue that Atticus maybe could have won. But then on the other hand, the way the townspeople react to the trial, the way that most of the townspeople seem to have kind of like accepted the racism, maybe he never could have won. So you can use either option. Just tell me what you think. So you can't get that one wrong as long as you justify it. And I can kind of see both ways. The second one, after Mr. Underwood wrote an article calling Tom's death senseless and comparing his death to the killing of a songbird, why did the townspeople think that Mr. Underwood was simply being foolish? So this is another interesting one, right? So Mr. Underwood is calling out their racism, like just face to face. He's being very confrontational about it. He's like directly saying like, you're wrong for this reason, and this reason. He probably expected like an argument back. He probably expected people to be angry at him, maybe for people to cancel their subscriptions. But he was angry when he said it, and he expected some sort of interaction back. Instead, everyone kind of just brushes him off and suggests that he's just being foolish. Why do you think the townspeople did that? Do you think it was easier just to like kind of brush it off and go back to the way things were? Do you think it's the townspeople don't want to think about the racist views in a logical light? Or what? You tell me. Give me your best answer for that. And again, you can't get it wrong because it's a what do you think type answer. Just make sure you justify your answer. After the trial, why does Jem become more sensitive? Now, there are a couple of thought processes on this. I suggested that this is because he's overcompensating, because he could see the lack of empathy during the trial, how Tom was treated during the trial, how people spoke about him, how Atticus was treated by a lot of the townspeople. He's seen all this cruelty, so now he's kind of overcompensating for it. But you could come away with a different interpretation. So again, like, give me what you think. You can't get it wrong. It's just what do you think? The next one does have a actual correct answer. How the Scout's opinion of Boo Radley changed throughout the course of the novel. We kind of went over that already, so we will just skip through that one. If you forget the answer, I would suggest referring back to the chapter 26 slide. How was Scout's teacher hypocritical with regards to a review of Hitler? We just spoke about that for a long time, about how looking at someone else doing something wrong is easier than examining what you're doing wrong sometimes. And you see this all the time. You see someone like get pulled over for speeding, and a person driving by kind of like, yeah, you should have been speeding, as they speed by, right? Like, it's always easier to like point out what someone else is doing wrong rather than take the blame for what you yourself are doing wrong. So the fact that the teacher was able to say, yeah, Hitler's a bad guy, he shouldn't be treating Jewish people and mentally disabled people and gypsies and everybody else this awful way, without noticing, yeah, we're kind of doing the same thing right here. Just the way people work sometimes. And then lastly, what was the possible theme, lesson about life in chapters 25 or 26? So a theme, again, is just a lesson that you learn, like Shrek. It's to, you know, be comfortable with who you are. In Rikki Tikki Tavi, it's that you need to be brave. In Cinderella, it's that good things happen to those who don't give up. In Little Red Riding Hood, it's not to talk to strangers. What was any lesson that you could have learned from chapters 26 or 25? And there are a lot in there. If you forget, you can always go back to chapter 25, chapter 26, and just tell me a lesson that you think the author was trying to teach. Once you're done with that, just submit it and I will grade it. The last thing I want to mention, for people who missed the beginning of this, because I see a few people are here now, if you go onto the Google Classrooms, the answers to the Monday through Friday language arts packet are there. When you, the activity I'm talking about for this is this one. The one that says Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, these, right? So just in case you weren't sure what I was talking about, I'm talking about the activities that look like this. So you read through each activity and you answer the questions. When you click on the Google Classrooms, it will bring up something that looks like this, and the answers just coincide. So the first one just asks what perspective the story is being told in, what point of view. It's being told in third point of view, so you just write third point of view. And I would suggest that you just fill it out on the actual packet paper, not make an entirely new document. You can just write on the packet itself. That way you can just circle answers when that's possible. When you have to write a sentence, a lot of the times in the packet it will say answers will vary. And that's just me acknowledging that there are going to be different ways to answer some of the different questions. One thing I'll also point out in number 5, when it's talking about correct the usage, that normally just means you change the tense of a word. So like the very first one, A, where are my new weights? Here it says, where are my new weights at? So you don't need at, you can just take that out. So you could just cross off at. You wouldn't need to rewrite the entire sentence. So you can just circle the word that's wrong and kind of pencil in the correct answer underneath for these. Same thing with number 4 for Tuesday. Most of these are either missing a letter, have an extra letter, or have the wrong letter in a spot. Like for pneumonia, you just need to put a P in front of it, so you can just pencil a P in there. And for physics, they used an I instead of a Y. So you can just put a little line through the I and put a Y above it. You don't have to rewrite the entire thing, unless you want to. So, and again, that only has the answers for this portion of the packet. The language art, or the reading portion and the writing portion, you're still on your own for. Although if you have a question on those, you can feel free to ask, and I will give you whatever guidance I can. So, in brief, your guys' assignments for this week: packet, quiz over chapters 25 and 26. There was an assignment for chapters 23 and 24, also in the Google Classrooms, that I put up on Tuesday. So that one, I believe, is multiple choice. And that's about it. Aside from your packet, just get this done at your convenience. Remember, if you want to watch the video, you can always scroll down to the very last couple parts of the assigned work, and there should be a link for the play version that you can watch through, and there should be a link to the audiobook and the story itself. So the PDF, the play version's right there. I posted it on May 28th, or not May 28th, March 28th. So if you go to March 28th, which would probably be the easiest way to find it, just click on the play version and you can watch the play version. It's, I think, a high school presenting it. So have fun with that. Make sure you get all your work done. Good job showing up, Elijah. If you have any questions, make sure you get those to me. And have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you on Tuesday.